Several factors can affect the way that a muscle contracts. The load against the muscle is certainly going to be a very important factor. For instance, the greater the load, the shorter the contraction, the shorter the duration. So if I am picking up a 5-pound bag of sugar, it's going to take less work for me to do that, so the contraction will be faster and I can hold that contraction for a much longer time than if I'm trying to pick up a 200-pound bag of potatoes. So the load would be greater, therefore the resistance would be greater. We've already mentioned recruitment. The more motor units used in an action of contraction, the faster that contraction will be produced and the longer that contraction can be sustained. The thing we haven't talked about yet is the muscle fiber type, the speed of contraction, and the way that those muscles form ATP. So there are several things that we're going to look at because not all muscle fibers are alike in their composition or their function. They vary in the amount of myoglobin. Myoglobin is a red-colored pigment that binds oxygen and stores it in muscle fibers. Skeletal muscle fibers have a whole lot of myoglobin, are termed red fibers, and they appear darker, like the dark meat in the chicken legs and chicken thighs. Those that have a low myoglobin content are called white meat. So this is what you see in chicken breast. Red muscle fibers also contain more mitochondria, and they have more capillaries, so a richer blood supply. Skeletal muscle fibers also contract and relax at different speeds, and the way that they generate ATP and how quickly they fatigue or tire is also different. So for example, a fiber is categorized as either slow or fast depending on how fast that ATPase, remember the enzyme that breaks down the ATP, so how rapidly that ATPase in its myosin heads hydrolyzes that ATP into ADP. So that's speed of contraction, determining whether it's fast or slow. But the way that the ATP is formed also helps to classify a muscle fiber in whether they are oxidative or glycolytic. Oxidative is further broken down into slow and fast oxidative, and these fibers are going to rely on aerobic respiration. Remember, aerobic respiration was the Krebs cycle in the electron transport chain where we were making lots and lots of ATP. The glycolytic fibers, remember glycolysis, no oxygen available or low oxygen content, so your glycolytic fibers are going to rely on anaerobic glycolysis to make ATP. So here you can see an image that shows you the three different types of muscle fiber found in tissue, and you typically do find all three of these in most muscles, just in different amounts based on the muscle and what its action is. So here you have the darkest of the red, which are the slow oxidative fibers, and then you have the ones that are sort of in between, which are fast oxidative, and then your fast glycolytic, your white meat fibers. So I want to move directly into an image and explain to you how these fibers play a role in what each of these athletes are doing. So your slow oxidative fibers have that dark red appearance because they contain a lot of myoglobin and a lot of capillaries. They also have a lot of very large mitochondria, so the slow oxidative fibers generate ATP mainly by aerobic respiration. That's why they're called oxidative fibers. These fibers are said to be slow, though, because the ATPase in the myosin heads hydrolyzes that ATP slowly. And so because of that, the contraction cycle proceeds at a slower pace than it does in fast fibers. So as a result, these have a slow rate of contraction. But because they are slow to contract, they're very resistant to fatigue and capable of prolonged and sustained contraction for many hours. So these slow twitch, fast, or fatigue-resistant fibers are adapted for maintaining posture and for aerobic and endurance-type activities such as running marathons. Your fast oxidative glycolytic are typically the largest fibers. They contain a lot of myoglobin and a lot of capillaries, so they also have sort of a dark red appearance. They can generate a good amount of ATP by aerobic respiration, so that gives them high resistance to fatigue. But they also have a high glycogen level, so they generate ATP also by anaerobic glycolysis. These are called fast fibers because the ATPase can hydrolyze the ATP 3 to 5 times faster than what we saw in the slow oxidative fibers. So it makes their speed of contraction faster. They reach peak tension more quickly than those of the slow oxidative, but it's briefer in duration. So your fast oxidative fibers contribute more to activities like walking and sprinting. Your fast glycolytic fibers, these are your white fibers, so they have a low myoglobin content, relatively few capillaries, few mitochondria, white in color. They contain a large amount of glycogen, and they generate their ATP mostly by glycolysis. So these fast twitch fibers are adapted for intense anaerobic movements of short duration, such as weightlifting, throwing a ball, but they do fatigue or tire very quickly. However, there are strength training programs that require great strength for short periods of time can increase the size and strength of the glycogen content of these fast glycolytic fibers. The fast glycolytic fibers of a weightlifter can be up to 50% larger of those than an endurance athlete or someone like me that doesn't do much of anything as far as exercise because of the increased synthesis of muscle proteins. So the more these muscles are being worked, the more proteins they are making in those muscle fibers. So the overall result is the muscle cell or the muscles enlarge due to hypertrophy or growing of the fast glycolytic fibers. So let's talk a little bit about the role of exercise. So the relative ratio of the fast glycolytic and the slow oxidative fibers in people is pretty much genetically determined, and it helps to account for the individual differences in the way that we all perform physically. For example, people with a higher proportion of fast glycolytic fibers typically excel in activities that require intense periods of activity, such as short, intense periods of activity, such as weightlifting or sprinting. People with higher percentages of slow oxidative fibers are usually better at activities that require endurance, such as long-distance running. And even though the number of skeletal muscle fibers usually doesn't increase with age, the characteristics of those fibers present can change to some extent. So endurance or aerobic type exercises such as running and swimming can cause a gradual transformation of some of those fast glycolytic fibers into fast oxidative glycolytic fibers, or the FOG fibers as they're sometimes called. The muscle fibers show a slight increase in diameter, increase in the mitochondria and the blood supply and the strength. Endurance exercises can also result, of course, in increased cardiovascular and respiratory health overall, and that can cause the skeletal muscles to receive better supplies of oxygen and nutrients, but they don't increase the muscle mass. They just help to get more oxygen out to those tissues so that we can produce that more ATP and increase our endurance. Exercises that require great strength for short periods produce an increase in the size and strength of the fast glycolytic fibers. The increase in size is due to synthesizing or making more of the thick and thin filaments, or increasing their size. The overall result is muscle enlargement. So you can see this in weightlifters and bodybuilders, those that are doing heavy resistance exercise. So you're building more myofilaments and myofibrils, storing more glycogen, building more mitochondria, so that you are able to have more strength to do those exercises. So if we do these types of exercises, endurance and strength, building weight resistant, of course we are increasing our overall mass of muscle and the way that we are able to use those muscles. And of course the opposite side of that is disuse atrophy. So hypertrophy is building of muscle, atrophy is the breakdown or the loss of muscle. This tends to happen in patients that are bedridden for long periods of time, patients that have limited mobility. Perhaps you have a cast on your leg for several months and you're unable to use those muscles in the leg. When you take that cast off, you'll see that the leg appears very skinny and you've lost a lot of muscle tone and a lot of muscle strength. So not using muscles, of course, is going to decrease the overall muscle mass and decrease the way that those muscles perform. So use it or lose it. And then finally, I want to talk briefly about oxygen debt. So during prolonged periods of muscle contraction, we increase our breathing rate and blood flow to enhance oxygen delivery out to muscle tissue. After the contraction is stopped, though, the heavy breathing may continue for a while. Oxygen consumption remains above the resting level. So depending on the intensity of the exercise, the recovery period may be just a few minutes, or it may last as long as several hours. So that gives rise to the term oxygen debt, that's used to refer to the added oxygen over and above the oxygen consumption that we have to get in when we're exercising, that's taken back into the body after exercise. So this extra oxygen is sort of used to pay back or restore metabolic conditions back to the normal resting level. So we have to increase the oxygen that we store in the myoglobin. We have to get more blood glucose out. So breathing faster, breathing harder, of course, is bringing in more oxygen. We take more oxygen out to muscle tissues, and of course that gives us more ATP to be made, and that blood is moving faster, so more blood sugar is flowing through out to body muscles, and we can store that for later. We also have to rebuild those creatine phosphate molecules that we used up during that direct phosphorylation to get those quick energy stores in that initial beginning of our exercise. And then, of course, the oxygen also is going to be responsible for converting some of that lactic acid that leads to muscle fatigue back to pyruvic acid that can then enter the Krebs cycle, cell respiration, and our aerobic respiration, and create more ATP for storage. All right, so I think that's enough on exercise. We will move now into the different types of muscles, since we have learned lots and lots and lots of things about skeletal muscle contraction.